Before we go into the details, I will introduce some main components involved in the project. The first component is the PLC. The model we use is the Omron CP1E SysMech. It is used to monitor the state of input device and make decisions to control the state of output devices. Next component is the relays. We have two relays, the right and the left relay. Basically, the right relay is used to control the operation of the motor, and the left relay is used to control the direction of the conveyor. Here is the motor, which is used to move the conveyor, and is controlled by the right relay for the on and the stop of the conveyor. Next is the pneumatic cylinders. So we have 4 cylinders, 2 cylinders at the top and 2 cylinders at the bottom. Upcoming is the directional valve. They act to control the flow of air into the cylinder, and each cylinder have one directional valve to control the operations. Final component is the proximity sensor, and the type we use is the MPN type, and it is used to detect the metal plate and allow the valve and pistons to perform the operations.
Yo, check this out!
Brief explanation of wiring. Basically, there are 5 inputs and 6 outputs. Here is a list of all device connection terminals. This is the schematic diagram of the overall connections. For example, for the left proximity sensors, the blue wire will be connected to the negative terminal of the 0 volt, and the brown wire will be connected to the positive 24 volt, and the black wire will be connected to the 0.02 input terminal. Starting from here, Aaron will explain to you all the operation flow using the ladder diagram.
Before all else, we should clarify the original state of all 4 cylinders. So for the bottom valves, the original state is in an extended state. But for the top valves, the top 2 valves, the original state is in a retracted state. So when the top valves are activated, they extend, and when the bottom valves are activated, they retract. We will now go into the explanation of the ladder diagram for this project. For the valves operation, we have assigned sequence 1 and sequence 5 to activate the top left valve, sequence 2, sequence 6 to activate the bottom left valve, and sequence 3 and sequence 4 to activate the top right valve and the bottom right valve respectively. Now we move on to the operation sequences of the project. The conveyor belt will move from left to right. The left sensor will first be activated by the metal piece on top of the container first. When the left sensor senses the metal piece, the circuit for sequence 1 is completed and sequence 1 will be activated. Latching will also be completed at the same time the metal piece is detected by the sensor. When sequence 1 is activated, the overall process is stopped because of the normally closed switch used for sequence 1. So when sequence 1 is activated, the whole circuit is not complete, it's cut off. So the conveyor belt stops. At the same time as sequence 1 is activated, a few things occur. From the valve's operation, we can see that sequence 1 will activate the top left valve. So when sequence 1 is activated, the top left valve is activated, making it going into an extended state. Also, the timer 001 is also activated at the activation of sequence 1. 1.5 seconds after the activation of timer 001, timer 002 is activated. When this happens, the activation of timer 002 along with the activation of sequence 1 will then trigger the activation of sequence 2. Sequence 2 is then latched. As mentioned before, sequence 2 will activate the bottom left valve, making it going into a retracted position. The ping pong ball then drops. After another 0.5 seconds after the activation of timer 002, timer 003 is activated. This will then open the circuit for sequence 2. Cutting off sequence 2 will then extend the bottom left valve back to its original position. 1 second after the activation of timer 003 also marks the end for timer 001. Therefore, both timers deactivate at the same time. The deactivation of timer 001 will also open the circuit for sequence 1. This will then deactivate sequence 1 and the conveyor belt will start moving from left to right once again. At the same time the conveyor belt starts to move, the top left valve is also retracted back to its original position as sequence 1 is deactivated. To prevent 2 balls from dropping instead of 1, a counter is activated after the activation of the top left valve. What this counter does is that it makes sure that after the top left valve extends and retracts back to its original position, it will not do so again until the counter resets. This marks the end of the drop of the first ball, and the conveyor belt moves on to the right sensor. Similarly, for the left sensor, when the right sensor is activated, it activates sequence 3, and sequence 3 latches onto itself. When sequence 3 is activated, there are a few things that happen. First, the top right valve is activated and it goes into an extended state. Second, the timer 001 is again activated. Lastly, the counter 002 resets. After 1.5 seconds of activation of timer 001, timer 002 is activated. Along with the activation of sequence 3, sequence 4 is activated. This then activates the bottom right valve and allows it to go into a retracted position. The second ball drops. 0.5 seconds after the activation of timer 002, timer 003 is activated. The activation of timer 003 then opens the circuit for sequence 4 and sequence 4 is deactivated. The deactivation of sequence 4 will then return the bottom right valve to its original position, which is the extended position. After 0.5 seconds, timer 003 then deactivates at the same time as timer 001. The circuit for sequence 3 opens and sequence 3 is deactivated, leading to the top right valve retracting back to its original position. To prevent 2 balls from dropping instead of 1, again a counter is used at the same time the top right valve is activated. This ensures that a second ball from the right tube will not fall in between the space of the top right valve and the bottom right valve. At the same time sequence 4 is activated, a sequence for changing the direction of the conveyor belt is activated. This sequence is called sequence 7. When sequence 7 activates, it opens the circuit for the left relay, which enables the conveyor belt to move from left to right. With this relay deactivated, the right relay will then be dominant and the conveyor belt will move from right to left. When the left sensor detects the metal piece again, a different sequence will occur. Now with the activation of sequence 7 along with the activation of the left sensor, sequence 5 is activated and sequence 5 latches onto itself. Along with the activation of sequence 5, the top left valve is activated and the timer 001 is activated as well. Other than that, the activation of sequence 5 also resets the counter 003. 1.5 seconds after timer 001 activates, timer 002 is activated. The activation of timer 002 along with the already activated sequence 5 will then activate another sequence called sequence 6 and it latches onto itself. Sequence 6 then activates the bottom left valve, allowing it to go into a retracted position, making the third ball drop. The activation of sequence 6 then activates sequence 8. Sequence 8 then opens the circuit for sequence 7 and sequence 7 is deactivated. As sequence 7 is deactivated, the left relay is then again activated and the conveyor belt will start moving from left to right. 0.5 seconds after the activation of timer 002, it deactivates and timer 003 commences. When timer 003 activates, it opens the circuit for sequence 6 and sequence 6 is deactivated. This will then extend the bottom left valve back to its original position. After another 1 second, timer 003 and timer 001 both deactivate and the top left valve retracts back to its original position. The process repeats itself until the 7th ball. After the 7th ball drops from the left tube, the counter 001 is initiated. And when the 8th ball drops from the right tube, the top right valve is activated. The activation of the top right valve and the initiation of counter 001 will initiate counter 004. The activation of counter 004 will open the circuit for the whole process and the conveyor belt stops. The process ends after all 8 balls have been transferred into the container.